So for the next 20 minutes, I wanted to, yeah, as Greg says, go a little bit back to basics maybe, but hopefully we'll keep your interest in talking about storytelling and research. But not just storytelling in the sense of nice presentations with pictures, but more fundamentally how we can use story throughout the research process. And I'm going to be making a lot of allusions to Star Wars as well. So I'm hoping many of you are familiar with that particular film franchise, which seems to be one of the most common ones that people have seen when I do my training on storytelling. So let me start with, just click here. Let's start our journey, as it were. Let's start our journey in the ordinary world, as all great stories do. And we have a hero, or at least a potential hero, probably more of an idealist at the moment, just like many of us as market researchers, we kind of dream of the perfect project. But we face, I think, increasingly some particularly tricky obstacles, and in any good story there are always some obstacles to overcome, or it wouldn't, of course, it wouldn't be really a story, would it? So here, I think the big obstacle for us is what I'm calling here the evil empire of technology and bullet point conversations. Technology is a great enabler, as we all know, and as we've seen this morning in all the presentations, which, as I say, kind of somewhat scared me. But I think technology can also create distance between us as researchers and the people we want to understand. And that's why I say the evil empire of technology. And I love this quote from Edward Tufte. Now, I think there's a kind of more general issue with PowerPoint. And the PowerPoint obviously is one of the technologies we're using, but kind of more the general idea of bullet point conversations, of the bullet point style of a lot of modern business, I think, is a real issue in market research, because it's kind of forcing us into sometimes very superficial interactions with consumers, and maybe stopping us from getting deeper into the sort of real issues that underlie a lot of their behavior and a lot of the things that we kind of need to know in our job. So with that, we're off on our call to adventure. So we need to set off on a journey. This is the journey of the project, and as I go through, I'm going to make reference to one specific project that I was recently involved in, which I can't say too much about, but it's kind of quite interesting, and it's a local project in Hong Kong, looking at mobile services and the communication styles in that category. But as with all good journeys, like Star Wars, the hero really needs a little bit of guidance before he sets off. In the case of Luke Skywalker, it's Obi-Wan Kenobi who gives him the sort of the wisdom that he needs, and then later, of course, Yoda. In the case of market research, it's not really a person who's necessarily the guru, but it's often just the information that's already out there in the world. That might be our current understanding of the client's business and the marketplace. But it can also be the kind of stories that we find in the category, what are called the unspoken codes. So in Hong Kong, if you look at a lot of the communication of mobile services, there are some sort of common themes that emerge, particularly in certain segments. And one of the bigger themes is around the idea of exploration, of possibilities, options, choices, etc. And you can see that in some of the visuals here. And there's also, because it's actually a very cluttered market, I would say, a very confused and fragmented market. And one of the more interesting observations on the category was that a lot of the mobile brands were doing a better job of branding Samsung and Apple than they were of branding themselves in this particular market. So there are some category stories that are kind of very easy to find. There are also often cultural stories and unspoken assumptions that we might make. And one of the interesting ones, certainly one of the initial questions or assumptions that I had, was about the color of one of the brands. Yellow is obviously very striking, and this particular brand were using it in a very striking way as well. But in the West, that would have certain meanings to us, like happy and sunny and warm. But actually, in a Chinese cultural context, it could have quite different meanings. Yellow was actually the color of the emperor in ancient China. So there's a lot of actually associations in Chinese culture with power and wealth and royalty, which have kind of potentially quite different meanings. So with that, armed with that knowledge, we have a kind of bit more direction now in terms of where we need to go on our journey. And this is the point in which any hero's journey, we enter the special world. The special world, we really need the kind of the mindset and the behaviors of the explorer, I think. In Star Wars, the explorer, of course, is Han Solo. So he's the guy who, perhaps like James T. Kirk, is kind of boldly going where no man has gone before. But of course, on any journey, there are always going to be challenges, and often there are temptations as well. There might be some siren voices calling. In research, I think one of the temptations is what I call the bullet point interview. So here's an example of a bullet point interview. This example is actually about children's packed lunches. But here you can see there's a lot going for this interview. The researcher gets answers to all the questions that they have on their checklist. But you can see from the style and the shortness of the sentences, it is kind of quite superficial and not really getting under the skin of what this mother in this case is doing, what's driving her behavior, what sort of kind of emotions and context that surround her feelings about packed lunches for her kids. Now, I'm going to contrast this with the next example, which I would call is the more challenging interview, of course, but brings greater revelations. So here you can see we're not following a formal script. We're giving a lot more opportunity for the participant to elaborate on her answers, but we're getting much deeper into the whys of her behavior and the context around that. So the kind of the temptation versus the challenging interview, and in the case of the Hong Kong mobile service market, for example, getting consumers to bring pictures and tell stories about what those pictures mean in relation to the category can be quite revealing. One of the common themes that came out in one of the categories here was of consumers talking about being in the know, not wanting to become out of date or obsolete, wanting to stay smart and efficient in their work and so on. So we can start to see, again, some common patterns, some common themes, not just in the sort of specifics of how the service is working, but more in terms of their bigger and longer term goals, their emotional rewards. And you can see that in this example of what I call the ladder of motivation, where if you talk to consumers long enough and letting them elaborate and explain the reasons behind some of the things they say, you start to understand that although mobile service is important, particularly they complain a lot about when it gets interrupted or when the connection is not clear. The reason for that is because they want to keep in touch always, and actually the reason driving that is they want to actually feel themselves up to date and knowledgeable. So it's actually about the self-fulfillment, their ability to do what they want to do in their lives, which in this case was generally a group of relatively more ambitious people. So now we have some knowledge of the category. We can start to think about our return and how we start to transform what we've learned. And here I'm using the analogy of the everyman archetype, because I think a lot of analysis frameworks are about how we fit how we work everybody's story together, how they fit into something, a sort of overall shape that we can understand and interpret in a relatively straightforward way. Again, many of you may be familiar with sort of the psychological models that are used by certain research companies. They kind of all come from the same source, essentially, which is the 4 evolutionary strategies that humans use to be successful, which are to defend what we have, to acquire new things, to bond with others, and to learn, so to develop. And you can see those strategies expressed in the dimensions or the tensions on this diagram. So you have Darth Vader, who's very much about control and stability, over to kind of a rebellious character. I guess Han Solo is the most rebellious character in Star Wars, who's all about change and openness. And then you have Chewbacca, who's very much the everyman, the good neighbor, wants to get on with everyone, doesn't want to stand out from the crowd, to Luke Skywalker, who eventually becomes the hero because he's able to become himself, to sort of be an individual. And one of the more interesting things about Star Wars as a story is that virtually all of the different kind of archetypes appear in one shape or form within the film. And you can see them all expressed here quite nicely. Now, taking that framework and applying it to some of the findings from the Hong Kong mobile market, you start to see a kind of interesting pattern, because the customer goals are quite often about control and stability, about being in the know, a little bit about security as well, at a more kind of functional level. But one of the main themes in terms of communication is actually on the other side of this map. It's about exploration. So there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between what people are looking for in mobile services and the kinds of values that are being communicated in the category. So with that kind of elixir of understanding, how do we then think about sharing that with our client? And here is where kind of we definitely need to sprinkle a little bit of the magic of story onto our data. So that's where we need a magician or a catalyst, as I would call it. And in Star Wars, R2-D2, the little kind of robot, is definitely the catalyst figure. So he's the guy who opens doors when Luke Skywalker is locked inside, or magically manages to switch off the tractor beam so Luke can escape from the Death Star, and so on. So he's the magician who makes things happen. And the magic of story is really quite straightforward. So I want to share just two things with you about story. The first one is just structuring the plot of your story. I'm sure everyone will have heard the kind of 3-part story structure: the beginning, the middle, and the end. Or maybe think about it in terms of the context, the action, and then the result. And within that, of course, there has to be a trigger. So there has to be something that kind of sets us off on our journey. In research, of course, that would be the client's business issue. In Star Wars, it's when Luke discovers that his uncle and aunt have been killed by the stormtroopers. There need to be a few twists and turns, a few plot points along the way, and then ultimately we reach a climax, a conclusion, and of course a result at the end. And I have a quite simple kind of 5-point formula for thinking about story, S-T-O-R-Y, which is that in any good story, in any good presentation, you have to have a star, who's the kind of center of the action. You have to have a treasure, which is what your star wants. Of course, there has to be an obstacle. There's someone or something, or sometimes multiple things that are getting in their way. And then there should always be a right lesson at the end, what everyone needs to take away, and why that's important to them, a sort of a call to action, if you will. So, in this presentation, we've talked about how the market researcher can gain kind of knowledge, discovery, connection, and ultimately transformation of the data. So, but I think what this is really all about is about how we humanize what we do. And if you remember Star Wars, Luke's right lesson at the end of the first film, when he manages to blow up the Death Star, is to actually rely less on technology and rely more on his own instinct, on his own human abilities. Which brings me very briefly back to sort of one of the things I started on, and I do like this quote, so I'll kind of paraphrase it. I think that the lesson here is that stories can get us far deeper into what we need to know than any kind of bullet points can. So with that, thank you very much for listening, and may the story be with you. And I think we have time for questions.